Who decides what's true or not? 500 years ago, it was the church, it was tradition, it was the rabbis, it was the Holy Scripture, it was the official interpreters of the Holy Scripture. Today, it's something much more private and much more internal. It's reason, it's conscience, it's intuition. So, in that way, I think an amazingly fundamental shift has taken place over the last few hundreds of years. How much the idea that humans were created in the image of God takes part in that.
Right. Hi.
Hello.
Your book the introduction starts off talking about significance.
I begin my introduction with this question, but in another sense. I begin my introduction with asking the reader to decide whether whatever happened in the last few hundreds of years, the amazing transformations of society, the scientific revolution, democracy, liberalism, feminism, secularism, whether they were significant as a point of reference for for each of us to decide, do you think this is significant? Because if you don't, then you probably think you should hold on to your tradition as if nothing has changed and simply plow on, rejecting whatever comes at you from the modern world and trying to adhere as much as faithfully as you think faithfully to the traditions of your forefathers. This is the ultra-Orthodox answer, right? I think the correct answer is, or I would believe that yes, very significant things have happened over the last few hundreds of years. Things that I would say have changed not only the way we live, not only how much we are comfortable or how much affluence we experience, but actually the way we perceive ourselves, the way we perceive the world, the way we perceive human society. Like, to give an example, the question, where or how do you decide what the source of authority is, has changed completely over the last few hundreds of years. Not only politically, of course, we decide authority differently today than 500 years ago. It's not top down. It's not that God christens a certain king and that they have a divine mandate to rule over us. It's that the people, bottom up, decide who the political establishment, the executive, will be by popular consent, etc. It's not only that, but we have changed the way we understand the authority for truth. Who decides what's true or not? 500 years ago, it was the church, it was tradition, it was the rabbis, it was the Holy Scripture, it was the official interpreters of the Holy Scripture. Today, it's something much more private and much more internal. It's reason, it's conscience, it's intuition. So in that way, I think an amazingly fundamental shift has taken place over the last few hundreds of years. And what I try to show in the book is how much the idea that humans were created in the image of God takes part in that.
Right. I recognize that there was the inherent idea of the fact that we've become much more individualistic. Can you explain to me a little bit about how the idea that we're created in God's image has led to us becoming more individualistic, more autonomous versus appreciating the collective?
I think this is the fundamental point that I make. I look in the book about how our relationship to conscience, to equality, to authority, to religion has changed, but the main thread running through the whole book is individualism, is the birth and the development of individualism. And what I try to say is that the image of God has a lot to do with it. How? Many people look at the idea of humanity being created in the image of God and they understand this as promoting equality. And of course it does. Mm-hmm. It means that each of us is inherently, internally, in some way, a divine spark or in God's image. And in that, which is the most important thing in us, we are equal. So we are fundamentally equal. But it's not only that. The idea that we are all created in the image of God means that each and every one of us is significant.
Sure.
Okay? Our lives are irreplaceable. We are one of a kind. We are unique, right? So, and in that way, um, the idea of the image of God allows a certain presence and a certain importance for the individual human being that was lacking before. And you can and what I try to and what I do in the book is compare laws legislated in the Bible according to that
Right.
idea with laws legislated in the broader Mesopotamian area of the same time, right? Babylon, Assyria, etc.
Right.
And you can see distinct differences. The laws of broader Mesopotamia and even Greece and Rome take the collective many times as the fundamental building block of society. Other times, the paterfamilias, the patriarch,
Yeah.
right, the head of the family, is taken as the only significant person, as the only legal subject, as the only person with authority and with agency. But the Bible doesn't accept that, right? Not that, of course, ancient Judea and the ancient Hebrews weren't patriarchal, etc.
Yeah.
Of course they were, but you see in the actual legislative attempt of the Bible and of the halakha afterwards that the individual takes on an importance of themselves and that influences the laws. To give a very simple example, in Babylon, people could be substituted for punishment of death. So if I killed someone, even accidentally, I could then give away my slave, or
Sure.
sometimes to be executed, and
Yeah.
that would be considered punishment. In Israel, ish bechet'o yumat. You can't substitute a person for another
Yeah.
person's sin.
Right.
Each life is not only equal, but significant in and of itself.
Sure. How would you say, like, this idea of everyone's created in God's image, and maybe our move as a society to a more individualistic and autonomous culture impacts modern Israel and our moral standing, our moral issues that are running through society and politics today?
I mean, first of all, Israel is part of the West,
Sure.
or at least in large part,
Yeah.
part of the West. I would say we are not completely Western, to in a good sense.
You're right.
But to a large extent, we are a Western country, and as such, we are part of the broader liberal order, which is based on this inherent individuality and inherent worth of every individual. So, of course, the Israeli political system and society is informed by those values. I think those values are tested time and again, not only by perhaps the characteristics running through our political and social psyche that are more traditional, non-Western, let's say, but also, of course, by the simple situation in Israel, which demands us to be tested again and again of how how much we are faithful to those values.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we've just been through a unbelievable trial these last 2 years, which had a lot to do with understanding humans as humans, appreciating life for its own sake, and conserving life as much as possible. And I don't think we always pass the test, but these are the questions that we're dealing with.
A really interesting idea that I was considering as I read through your book was the idea that we consider ourselves really polarized within the society, that we see how we are today as defined in different extremes. However, you point out that we're all rooted in that same belief, that we're all rooted in this ancient kind of developing idea that we're created in God's image. How can we recognize that fact and apply that to kind of come to some sort of reconciliation within where we are today, especially within Israeli society, where we're more divided than ever?
Yeah, I think one of the main dividing lines between in Israeli society is between those who think that the liberal order, liberalism, universal humanism, rights discourse are all foreign ideas, are all ideas that are thrust upon us by the international community or the West, or perhaps this is Christian morality, some rabbis would say. And I think if my book tells anything, it is that these ideas have not only developed out of Judaism, but are inherently Jewish, are in their base and in their essence as Jewish as chapter 1
Sure.
of Genesis.
And by
right?
liberalism, you mean?
Broadly, rights discourse, equality between
Sure.
people, rule of law, I mean limited government,
Right.
all the things that, except for voting, etc., that is perhaps a more democratic adjunct value, we all enjoy, right? And there is a clear line today within rabbis, I would say, of the more extreme orthodoxy, ultra-orthodoxy certainly, also Chardal, within religious
Right.
Zionism, that want to establish a more halachic state or a complete theocracy, and see these values as foreign. And what I'm saying is they're not foreign, they're ours.
Right.
And we need to embrace them. And because in order to fulfill the message of Judaism, you cannot forfeit these values, right? Thinking that you can disqualify rights discourse or equality between all humans, etc., and still be true to your Judaism is wrong.
I think a lot of personal beliefs have become very ingrained and inherent to our identity. So how do you see balancing that idea? There's a huge emphasis on those modern beliefs of like traditionalism. How do you balance the modernity with those ideas that you bring up?
So I think balance is really the key word here. I think a balance should be stricken, and we need to reach that balance. I reject the idea that we can now operate or live a fulfilling life in a functioning society only through adhering to the liberal order's framework. The liberal order is a framework. It's an understanding between citizens and government, between citizens among themselves. It's not enough to order a functioning and fulfilled society. It's not enough to give us the meaning that we need from life. So in that way, that's exactly the place that tradition comes in, religion, nationality comes in, community comes in, sometimes even sports, anything that can broader and infuse our sense of identity, of meaning, of community, which is needed, which are things that many times the liberal order can't give us. So this idea, the idea of the image of God and all its implications, everything that it has come to develop in the modern West, in itself is just one idea of quite a few that I think we need to hold together. And indeed, we need to strike some sort of balance. I think there's an ongoing negotiation always between ideas that push for more individuality and ideas that push for more community, more collectiveness, nationality, etc. And this dialogue simply has to continue.
The idea that you bring up is that today we emphasize freedom as something that only comes from an individual idea, versus in ancient times, it was something that you could find within community.
Is that
as a collective?
That's
okay,
right.
so can you expand on that idea?
So freedom is one of the oldest ideals of humanity, right? We all want to be free, but of course, freedom itself, it has been defined in many different ways. Not only in the West, it's even, there's Eastern ideas of freedom, etc. Today, we all generally adhere to an understanding of freedom as autonomy. I want to do whatever I wish without hindrance. Don't disturb me. I want the government to allow me, right, etc. This is basically the liberal idea of freedom. What I show in the book that further back in the history of the West, the idea of freedom was participating in the legislative body of a certain community. If you were a person who was part of the body that legislates, that makes the laws for how a certain community functions, that meant you were free. right?
Sure. Yeah.
Now, we have a strand from that idea still alive today, and that's the idea of collective independence, the idea that in order for a people to be free, they need to be sovereign, they need to be independent,
Sure.
they need to fulfill the right of self-determination, etc. All that's close to that old idea that freedom is realized within a community, within a collective. Now, in Israel today, you can very simply see the meeting point and sometimes tension between these two ideas. Even in the last 3 years with the current government and its wish for judicial overhaul, what did they say? They said the legislative body does not have enough power to decide what this collective is doing. And instead, we've given authority to people who understand freedom more as an individual, autonomous ideal, right? And they legislate, or they rule according to rights discourse, whereas the ability of the collective to decide for itself what it wants, even if it sometimes is in friction with rights discourse, is abandoned or is too little given weight, etc. That's the argument we had, right? And again, I think this argument also is something that needs to be constantly negotiated. I don't think there is an easy solution this or that way. These are both important ideals. I as a Zionist, I believe that the Jewish people should be able to realize the right to self-determination and to chart out their course, etc. So obviously, I think this is an important ideal, and it's part of my understanding of freedom of the Jewish people. Then again, as a liberal, I believe that each and every one of us needs to be able to fulfill themselves autonomously and without hindrance.
Sure.
How do you put these two together? There's a tension, and then again, we're doing it right now, right? Israel is still a liberal democracy, and this discussion between these two ideals again needs to go on and to develop itself.
How do you even begin to start having discussions about something that in a lot of ways is foreign to today's society, something that I think a lot of people struggle to recognize, the ideas of freedom, of autonomy, of individualistic versus collectivistic? How do you begin to even start having conversations that confront that tension, the beliefs that we have built our society on, that the rest of the world still, in a lot of ways, built upon? Like, how do you begin to even bring up a conversation that is so different than the world that we know today?
I actually think that the ideals of personal autonomy and freedom as being free from hindrance are very popular, and I think everybody holds on to them. If anything, there's a problem sometimes introducing that other idea of the freedom of the collective.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right. This is a constant challenge. I even address it in the afterword of the book. I think part of the crisis of liberalism that we are experiencing today, not only in Israel, but in the whole world, right? In the US, in India, in Brazil, in Hungary, etc. Part of the reason there are forces that are challenging liberal common sense ideals or things that were considered obvious just a few years ago is because there was this accentuation, perhaps, in the ideal of freedom as individual autonomy, which led for many people to a loss of their sense of identity, their sense of collective identity, that led to a loss in religious adherence, to growing secularism in the entire West. And I think many people are troubled by that. And what we see today in the rise of populism, within even, I would say, identitarian, anti-liberal, left-wing politics, and certainly with religious fundamentalism that are all rising as part of the crisis of liberalism, what I see there is an attempt to get back some sense of collective identity, some sense of meaning that perhaps was lost over the last 20 years with the development or let's say, hyper development of the liberal order.
Before I go on to my next question, can you define liberalism?
Yes.
Just so that we are on the same
I
page.
actually wrote another book on liberalism.
Ah.
It was out in Hebrew last year. Liberalism basically is the political framework that holds that individuals have depth or dimensions that are sacred. These are
Sure.
our rights.
Okay.
That the fulfillment of these dimensions is crucial for their freedom, and that government that rules by consent of the governed needs to protect those areas.
Okay.
So it's rights discourse, it's equality, it's limited government,
Sure.
it's the consent of the governed
Yeah.
to the government, etc. That's basically what
Sure.
we're talking about. Liberalism has been basically the only game in town in the West since the early 90s collapse of the communist bloc, right?
Yeah.
We don't have another ideology that tries to answer the question, how shall we live a fulfilled life in a modern community, in a modern collective, right? In a modern state. Communism tried to give an answer to that. Fascism gave an answer to that, right?
Right.
Today, only liberalism is a comprehensive ideology that gives an answer to that, except perhaps religious fundamentalism, which has its own answer,
Right.
but in the West is a very small minority. And yet, there's a crisis. And yet, we see that people aren't satisfied with what's going on today with the liberal order. And the liberal order is challenged by populism, etc.
Tying back to what you were saying before about that idea of confronting the tension, how can we use Judaism to better the ways that we understand ourselves as a whole? And also, how can that play into Israeli society? And should that even be playing a part in Israeli
Or
society?
Judaism.
There's a lot of opinions out there.
Okay. First, I'll say, what my book shows is that at the first centuries AD, the baton was, as it were, passed to Christianity. And the world we live in today is a world fashioned in large part by Christianity, right? By the Catholic Church and later by Protestantism. The liberal order came out of Protestant societies,
Right.
mainly Britain, England, 16th, 17th, etc. centuries. That's what we're talking about. Now, Judaism sits at the inception of that, at the
Right.
beginning of that process, and it today also is part of that world, but it still has its differences with what we're talking about. And really, I think these differences can be a great advantage. So, I mean, of course, I'm a religious Jew myself. I'm very much for, I don't think there's an option of not integrating Judaism to Israeli society. But it can even give us important assets when we try to understand, to better fashion a liberal society. And I'll give you a very simple example connected to what we talked to right now. We talked about the crisis of liberalism that I understand as a reaction to an accentuation of individualism and the understanding of freedom as autonomy.
Sure.
In the Jerusalem Talmud, there is this famous dialogue between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva says, "V'ahavta re'acha kamocha," love your friend, right? Love your colleague. Ze klal gadol b'Torah. It's the greatest law in the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And Ben Azai then says, "Ze sefer toldot Adam, ze klal gadol mize." This is the book of the history of man, of humanity. That's an even greater law. The verse he's quoting is from Genesis chapter 5. It's the first verse, and the continuation of the verse is זה ספר תולדות אדם, ביום ברו אלוהים אדם, בדמות אלוהים עשה אותו. It really, it spells out the very idea of my book. Humans were created in the image of God, and as such, we all share a common history. We are all equal in that history, and Ben Azai is trying to say universalism, individualism, perhaps rights. We are all part of a one big equal human family. Okay, so that's liberalism. That's fantastic.
Sure.
I'm a liberal. I'm for that. Rabbi Akiva, though, in the sentence right before that, gave something that holds, I think, a fertile tension with it, because he says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your colleague, love your friend. It's much more particularistic. It's not just love anybody. It's love who you're with, love who you are engaged with, who is part of your community. And I think that part complements in a fantastic way the idea of universalism and individualism. We really, what Judaism does is give us the communal and collective side of our lives that we really cannot do without. So Judaism has always been much more collective, much more communal, I would say, than Christianity, certainly more than Protestant Christianity. And I think that's something it can give today to Israeli society, if not the world, as an ideal that needs to be held and not given up in the face of other ideals, which are important also, as universalism and individualism.
Can you speak to maybe some tangible, more concrete efforts you think can be made within society?
In Israel?
Yeah, in Israel.
I mean, look, I think we're just beginning to recuperate, and we are in the beginning of a long process of healing from the last 2 years, from the war, from the trauma of the 7th of October 23. We're really just beginning. And I think, I don't want to get too much political. I think we need a leadership that will be able to, minimally to be trusted,
Sure.
further to unite the people together. It's something that it will take years to build on what we've just been through. So really, right now, I think the most important thing is to get a process of some sort of consolidation and healing going. And I think we will need another leadership for that. But again, I don't want to get too much political.
How did your personal background shape your views of faith and moral responsibility and of the image of God? How does your personal background play into all of these?
I grew up in a secular and even atheist family, and I grew closer to the Jewish tradition and to faith over the years, since I was the beginning of my 20s. And I think some of the things that I most identify with in the Jewish tradition are the things that I fear are sometimes neglected by the more religious part of Jews in Israel today, like the morality of the prophets, like the whole ethos of prophetic talking truth to power, like the image of God, like universal equality and freedom, like the commandment to love the stranger, V'ahavta et hager, which is the most commonly recited command in the Torah. Maybe because I was coming from a more secular background, these are things that I feel are lacking today in religious Jewish society in Israel. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, and it was first published in Hebrew, was to sort of introduce an idea that I think is at the heart of Judaism to many people who I think have forgotten it.
And do you think that has become apparent in just the way that we hold ourselves as a society? Do you think it's become kind of integral to who we've become as a people?
Unfortunately, again, I think most religious people in Israel are in dialogue with modernity, with modern values, with the liberal order. They accept the basic ideals of this reality today, but there are large chunks of the religious public, certainly ultra-Orthodox, but also from religious Zionism, that reject these ideals, right? Reject universalism, reject freedom as autonomy, reject feminism, reject the liberal order. And I think it certainly shows today in our government, in the way we handle crises in Israel, in what's happening in the West Bank. Yeah, and I think we are in basically we're in trouble if we don't return to these values, which again I emphasize are basic Jewish values, not only Western values. I think I fear for our future, right? I don't think Israel will be able to survive as an illiberal theocracy of some sort. I just don't think it's viable.
That's interesting to me because you talk a lot about how we believe we're polarized, but we're all rooted in the same sort of beliefs. But you also say that you don't think there's a way for us to like move forward. Have you like received any criticism for the ideas that you bring up?
Well, it's interesting. There are many secular thinkers that balk at the idea that religious tradition has been at the root of what we today consider our modern, secular, liberal society. And there's a whole strand of thinkers who say actually liberalism is a rejection of religion and etc. And of course it is in certain ways, but I certainly hold that it's informed and based on these ideas. And for some people that's just too much, and they really reject it. Or many others would say the whole of liberalism and democracy are only based on Greek and Roman thought, and the Bible has only interfered and put up obstacles to what we have today. And okay, I mean, you can argue for that. I certainly don't believe it, and I don't think Greece and Rome alone would have developed, given enough time, the liberal order. But there's another interesting criticism which I've found from the opposite side, and some people understand my book because I show how even secularism came out of the idea of the image of God, and we can say a few words about that. I had a review of the book written in Christianity Today. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's a very popular Christian magazine in the US that blames me for being a secular Jew that promotes secularism through this book, because I say that the unavoidable consequence of the idea of the image of God is secularism, right? Okay. Which I'm not a secular Jew. I'm not promoting secularism. And of course, that's not what I write. I do write that secularism has indeed developed out of this idea. Because notice, when you empower the individual, when you put a lot of emphasis on autonomy, on freedom, you can get to the point, and many people have got to the point, in which a father figure in the sky, a big king in the sky, can seem to be putting obstacles to our autonomy. And thus we must reject God out of normative reasons, because because God interferes with my freedom, and not because I simply realize through the scientific revolution or whatever that God doesn't exist. That's what I write in the book, but I'm not promoting that. I mean, needless to say, again, I'm religious myself. But that, of course, happens if you look at an atheist thinker like Albert Camus, right? Camus will say, we rebel against God because only through the rejection of any fake belief in some compensation that we will get after life, or fake meaning that we get today in life when we are living, only by that rejection can we truly live an authentic Sisyphean life, right? Okay, it's Camus' understanding.
Sure.
Fine. And it comes from this empowerment of the individual that is rooted in the image of God. But of course, it's not unavoidable, and I leave the reader to think whether it's good or bad. I don't promote it in any way.
Yeah.
Right.
The way that it seemed to me that the book was laid out, and the idea that you were introducing, was that modern secularism begins through the idea that we're made in the image of God, but then slowly we begin to reject it throughout our...
What, secularism?
Yeah, so our modernization.
Look, the whole liberal order begins within Christianity by religious people, right?
Right.
By theologians within Christianity, by even John Locke, considered by many the father of liberalism, was a religious person and quotes the Bible and says the image of God grants us certain things. I mean, and he's not doing it just for show. He is a religious person. The Puritans that built the United States with fundamental values of freedom of speech, of freedom of religion, they did it for religious reasons. And they left England to the US, to the North America, of course, for religious reasons. So religion is infused in all these ideas from its beginning, from their beginning. What I do say is that the next stage, as it were, when this develops, can be for people to reject religion, right? As they rejected the religious origin of kings and of monarchy and of kingly authority, as they rejected the authority of the Pope and the church theologians because they wanted, as Protestants, to interpret the Bible for their own, right? Martin Luther, etc., right? So they can also reject God's own authority because that authority is understood as infringing on their idea of freedom, on their dignity as independent human beings, and even on their morality. If I do something only for the promise of heaven, is it moral? Is that a moral act? Or can it be moral only if I do it while rejecting any promise of God for this way or the other, right?
You dedicated your book to your father, and I'm curious about his influence.
I owe so much to my father just for bringing me up, teaching me how to think, allowing me to think creatively and as much as I wanted, allowing me to dream really in my childhood. And but my dedication to my father is for all those reasons and for my love to him, but also simply because as modern ideas come from ancient ideas, so do I come from him, right? It's this idea that ideas don't come from anywhere, from nowhere. There's a lineage, there's a history for each idea, for the idea of modern freedom, modern equality. And as such, I myself also have a history. I came from somewhere and I'm indebted. I'm indebted to that somewhere. And that's my father and my mother.
Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Beautiful book. Good ideas.